Okay, so good morning, everybody. I'm Miracle Draka. I'm the director of the Cage Research Centre at Warwick, and I'm one of the co-organisers of today with Juan and Brian. Okay, so welcome to our Modelling an Evolving Economy event. Hello to the audience online. So before we begin, a few bits of housekeeping. For the in-person audience, note there are no fire drills planned for today. So if the fire drill goes off, it's real. And so you follow the instructions of the digital catapult fire wardens. The toilets are located to the left of the auditorium as you exit the room. There is password-free Wi-Fi available in the venue. Connect to the digital catapult network, scroll down and accept the terms and conditions. So you don't have to give your email address, right? So it's a low overhead Wi-Fi system. Also, feel free to tweet and tag us with handles visible at the bottom of the slides that we've got. Okay, so I think you'll agree this is a brilliant and inspiring venue and been here until last week. So what I'd like to do now is let the CEO of Digital Catapult, Jeremy Silva, just tell you a bit about the amazing and diverse work that the Digital Catapult has been doing.
Thanks, Draka. Good morning, everybody. It is a real pleasure to welcome you all here to Digital Catapult, those of you in the room and those of you online. Absolutely delighted to be hosting the session today. I thought I might just take a couple of minutes and tell you a little bit about the work that we do here in this building and around the country, just to give you a sense of kind of why it's relevant to us, this conference. So Digital Catapult is part of a network of catapults. There are 9 catapults altogether around the UK, all of whom were set up 10 years ago by Innovate UK, funded by them with a core grant and then a remit to go out and compete for collaborative research and commercial revenues, with a view to accelerating inventiveness and creativity and ideas, products that come out of the research base into the market and get them to the market more quickly. And so across the network, there are some very specific catapults that are focused, for example, on cell and gene therapy or offshore renewable energy. In our case, the digital remit is probably the broadest and in some respects the least easy to contain, given the obvious connections to every aspect of society and the economy that the word digital has. So we've framed that, we've given that a kind of a focus that allows us to actually make a difference, as opposed to being dissipated across that wide waterfront. And for us, at the core of all of this, when we really sat down and said, well, look, what can an organization like this do and how can it make a difference? We realized that in the end, it's got to be at the core all about driving early adoption. So taking the technology opportunities, taking the ideas that are coming out of research or out of the startup community, and taking that more quickly to market on a very simple basis, that if you are an early adopter, that will give you a competitive advantage, that will lead to growth, and that will lead to further private investment. And if we can achieve those things, then we're being successful. And of course, we recognize that being an early adopter is high risk. And whilst that's comfortable for startups, or actually it's never really even comfortable for startups, but it's the natural domain of startups, it is nonetheless something where small additions of public money and strategic interventions can make a significant difference. And so that's really the basis of our approach. In the last couple of years, what's been very clear is that in addition to that remit of early adoption, that what goes along with what we might term in broad terms digitalization is an increase in sustainability and a reduction in carbon footprints. And so that has become for us really a dual challenge and a dual mission. So both to increase the adoption and to take advantage of what the technologies have to offer in a responsible way, and at the same time do that in a way that actually reduces people's emissions, makes them more efficient, and therefore makes a contribution towards net zero. So that's the core of the mission that drives us here. And to do that, we work with about 400 companies a year both early stage companies, scale-ups and multinationals. And we listen very closely to them, we engage with them and talk to them a lot, and we try and figure out, well, what are the things that we could build, what are the facilities, what are the environments that we could create that would enable them to get hands-on experience of technology, to develop the applications of that technology that are relevant to their business and to their business model, and to get them up the curve more quickly. And so we build, I think to date, we've built 7 5G test beds around the country, each of which is populated by cohorts of businesses that are getting to grips with what 5G could mean for them. We currently are just about to open 2 virtual media production test stages, one in London and one in Gateshead, which are allowing companies to get involved and understand what the opportunities of disrupting media production technologies could feel like, could do for them. Again, reducing cost, reducing time to market, but also actually reducing their carbon footprint. We are about to open here, well, we're about to start building here, I should say, a major new Telecoms Lab, which is designed to increase interoperability across Open RAN components. So in the wake of UK government's decision to remove Huawei from the UK telecoms network, there's a massive void, but also an opportunity to create new entrants and pathways for new entrants. So you can see we're deployed across quite a range of technologies that are behind those, whether that's AI or whether it's 5G or whether it's virtual reality or augmented reality. And we have teams of experts who are deep experts, technical experts in those areas. But actually, increasingly, of course, our view is that those individual technologies don't really work alone, that it isn't about AI on its own, it's about the conjunction of AI in a broader technology context. And therefore, we've actually grouped our strategy and provided a focus across 3 broad areas, one of which is not surprisingly from what you've just heard me say, infrastructure and digital infrastructure. So what are the enabling networks and environments that enable all of these applications to develop? The second are really the supply chain and digital supply chains. So one of the things that is that we can be particularly useful for industry in is because we are a neutral, agnostic player in the marketplace. We're not trying to sell anything, any particular commercial solution. Providing a kind of a neutral view is incredibly valuable. And in the conversation about digital supply chains, where the relationships between different companies in supply chains has a built-in commercial tension in it, having a neutral player that can facilitate that and enable adoption of technology solutions in those environments is really helpful. And then the third area, again, perhaps not surprisingly given what I've just said, is virtualization. So in industrial terms, these days we talk about cyber physical infrastructure. We also talk about digital twins. In the culture and media space, we tend to talk about the metaverse. Actually, the kind of underlying technologies that enable those innovations are very closely related, and there's a lot of crossover there. So we're working in those 3 areas broadly. And it's absolutely brilliant that you guys are sitting having this conversation today about how we actually identify and measure what sort of economy we're actually in and what it actually looks like. Because one of the things that we're so conscious of in doing this is that we're all about trying to make impact in business. We're all just about trying to make a difference to the economy. And our conversations with our stakeholders, both with the businesses themselves, but also with our funders and with our political masters, are often complex and involve different levels of understanding, time lags, challenges in terms of different perceptions of what we mean when we talk about innovation, or what do we mean when we talk about impact. It's easy to point to a private investor responding to an acceleration program, and we run a number of those, and we use private investment into early stage businesses as a good proxy for the impact that we're having, because it's very visible and there to see. Much more difficult to see the impact in a large multinational company who we may have helped along their IoT journey or along their 5G adoption journey, where the level of investment, the nature of that investment is much less visible and deliberately so on the part of that business. So there are some really interesting questions for us in terms of how we measure our own impact. And obviously in doing that, we're also thinking about, well, how does that actually influence and have an impact across the economy itself? And our interest is, although we rejoice in this wonderful building, and it's great to have you all here physically in the room, as well as folks online, the work that we're doing is global in nature. It's a national in its footprint. So we have activities in the northeast of England. We have a growing centre in Belfast and in Northern Ireland, and also in the southwest, where we're working very closely with the University of Bristol and Wecker and other universities in the region. And our whole approach to what we're doing is essentially to do that across the UK. And whilst we can all debate what levelling up used to mean, whether it means something different now, whether it means anything at all, I think what we all feel and agree is that there are enormous regional imbalances in the UK, and that if we can do things to actually equalise those or to move in that direction, then that's obviously something that is incredibly beneficial and powerful. And as an organisation like this, we have the ability to do some of that. So absolutely fascinated to see how your discussions go during the course of the day, and a real pleasure to have you all in the room, and I hope you have an excellent day. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jeremy. Okay, so I'll just have some kind of give some brief words about the motivation, the intellectual motivation for the day before we kick off with Mercedes' talk. So, we've designed this workshop to sort of try and push evidence-based policy in the UK forward, right? And it's not so much as going forward as evolving, right? So since the early to mid 2010s, we all know that there's been a big surge of new knowledge related to big data and machine learning. We can measure things that we couldn't measure before. In particular, we can now actually measure diversity, whether that diversity be in terms of ideas, new products or skills, and we can also track how that diversity evolves. Economics has traditionally struggled with understanding qualitative change, and Brian, Juan and myself felt that a range of approaches to this was emerging and needed to be brought together. So today you're going to see a lot of work covering things like how we can develop alternative taxonomies of industries and occupations, how we can measure innovation in new ways, and how we can model the economy as an evolving system. Furthermore, we're going to try and do that tricky thing of merging so-called mainstream approaches with more heterodox perspectives. We had a tremendous response to this event, and I think it's both because we managed to connect many nodes or research communities and because there's a demand to bring these perspectives together in a constructive and creative way. Furthermore, we know that a major issue with the modern knowledge economy is information overload, and I think the best way to deal with that is with studied curation and good intellectual taste, and that's what we're aiming for with this event. Finally, I'll just note a series of thank yous before we start. Carolina Danyuk from Digital Capital and Sarah Shepherd from ESCO provided outstanding and, let me say, shrewd organizational support for the event. Josh Allen and Jane Snape from my Cage Research Centre at Warwick have also provided ever conscientious backup. I'd recommend you have a look at the Cage website and our stuff. We've got a great depth and range of research available. I always describe Cage as like a cult indie band. You may not have quite heard of us, but we produce some of the best and most stimulating research around. Like all great bands, have got good merch. So I think Sarah and Carolina, we might be preparing a merch package for you later on of like a Cage magazine and a pen and so on, right? So I'll leave it at that for that kind of general kind of motivation. So now we'll kick off with our first keynote of the day. So I'd like to welcome onto the stage Mercedes Delgado from the Copenhagen Business School, MIT Innovation Initiative and Institute for Strategy and Competitiveness at the Harvard Business School. So you've got 35 minutes for the presentation. I have a stopwatch, and then we'll have some questions.
So thank you. I'm super excited to be here today to discuss with all of you about these important topics that already have been initiated through Jeremy and Mirko. And the topic, based on the feedback that I got from the organizers, is talk about resilience of cities, resilience of industry clusters. And I'm going to do that based on some of my work on 3 areas: mapping industry clusters and how do they matter for innovation and resilience. Then mapping a supply chain economy that includes logistics, but include many other things. Any firm that is producing innovative inputs, that's going to be very important for innovation and the jobs of what we call the jobs of the future. Then a third topic very much related to the other two is that to accelerate innovation and growth, we need to use all the talent we have. So I'm going to talk about gender inclusion in innovation. And then through the discussion, I'm going to have some policy implications throughout the presentation. So what is a cluster? I don't think I need to define that for this group. We are in the knowledge quarter. You have universities, you have digital firms, startups, you have support institutions like Digital Catapult. So you are in a vibrant IT, we see what name we give it, and we gave it a lot of names this morning. It could be information technology, it could be a digital cluster. But let me, here you have another example, is the sample very well known of biopharma in the Boston region. In a sort of a red cardinal color, you have MIT. So you can see a lot of biopharma firms surrounding MIT. But not only you have the university and the big firms, you also need firms that are going to be producing inputs. You have a lot of biotech firms there, like Amgen, for example. You need support institutions like venture capitalists. You have flagship ventures there. Many of you may be aware of this very important VC firm, flagship venture, because they actually accelerated Moderna. A very young firm within this innovation ecosystem, this biopharma cluster, only 10 years old firm, is going to develop one of the key messenger RNA vaccines that maybe some of you, or at least I have benefited from. So we have this geographical concentration of firms that are related, and the way they are related are by skills, input-output linkages, technologies, and very important, these support institutions. Support institutions that have been evolving. Use the classic one is universities, risk capital, but more and more we see the role of innovation spaces like the one we're here today, the Digital Catapult. All right, so they matter that everywhere, but I know there is a lot of data scientists here in the room. So how do we measure them? We collaborated with the US Department of Commerce to build this tool. What they asked us to do, they asked, can you map all the industry clusters in the US? And this is a project that we developed, and the we here is Michael Porter, very well known for all the work on industry clusters, Scott Stern at MIT, and myself, thinking, okay, how do we answer the question of what type of economic activity benefit from proximity, from being close to? And to answer that question, we have publish algorithms, a paper that tries to answer the question, and I'm going to give you a very intuitive explanation on how we did it. What is important, as a result, we create this tool where you can go to the tool and see all the industry clusters in the US and how do they evolve over time. And that's very important for policymakers, also for firms that are trying to decide, where should I grow? Where should I locate? Where are my suppliers? Where are the investors? To do that, and be very intuitive, because you can always read the papers, and at the end of the, I'm happy to also share the slides. There is a link to the papers. But the idea, very basic, you have to separate local industries from traded industries. The local industries, they don't agglomerate. They're in every city. Think of restaurants, for example. But the ones that we really care about for innovation are the ones that tend to be geographically concentrated, what we call traded industries, like, for example, pharmaceutical preparations. Now, once we have separated them, we have to see which one of the traded industries are related to each other, benefit from this geographical proximity, from this density of firms. And to do that, we use a clustering analysis, now what people call topic analysis. a machine learning grouping. But this is actually a field that many of you know is a very old field where we've been building groups. And the groups here are industries, and we're using 1,000 industries, and we want to create a group of industries that are more related to each other than to other groups. And that's how we're going to define these clusters of related industries, because individual industries may not be meaningful. As you also mentioned, Jeremy, there are connections between industries. So we need to be thinking about clusters of related industries. Here you have the example of how the biopharmaceutical cluster looked like from running our algorithm versus the medical device cluster. As many of you may know, it's very easy to create groups. What is difficult is to justify that you have created an optimal group. Could be, is it 100 cluster? Is it 51? So we develop a function and a process to really try to get this grouping that's going to capture economies of agglomeration of input-output, knowledge linkages, occupational linkages, and others. So once you have the industry boundaries of a cluster, then you can map them across locations. So here is, for example, the medical devices clusters. What are the regions that are highly specialized in this economic activity? Those are the ones in blue and in light green. Regions highly specialized. Many of you will have guessed Boston, San Diego, but the reality is that there are other regions specialized in medical devices like Salt Lake City, Minneapolis, areas in Seattle. And as a firm and as a policymaker, this is a very important information. Now, we identified 51 clusters. They are not isolated. They are connected to each other. Perhaps not surprisingly, biopharma is connected with medical devices, with IT. But now what do we do with this? What we do with this, and you can do this in every city, in any part of the world, is to then try to figure out what is your city good at. Here you have the clusters, the ones that are in color are the industry clusters where Boston region is highly specialized, has a comparative advantage on this type of economic activities. And you can see that there is almost a super cluster of biopharma, medical, IT. Not surprising to you, if you go to Kendall Square, you see all that. But you also have very sophisticated services, fintech, insurance tech, marketing services. Now, in white, what you have are clusters where they still don't have the strength, but maybe these are some interesting areas for diversification, where you could then think about how can I strengthen the innovation ecosystem that I have. Not surprisingly, in this ecosystem, what we're seeing now is a lot of nanotechnology being developed, which is in the intersection of medical and physics and biopharma, and also AI in the intersection of these clusters. Now, I have done more of a decade of work on this topic, where we show that indeed these industries that participate in industry clusters, they benefit, and they benefit in terms of startup activity. I very often tell startups, look around. You're not being born in a random place. You are born in a place where, if you look around, you have probably some of the key resources that you need to scale up. Because startups are more likely, as we show in our research, to be born in these industry clusters. So I wouldn't be surprised that in this area, we're going to see a lot of digital, IT, enterprise software kind of startups being born and developed. We also show that it matters for the creation of jobs and innovation. And I'm going to discuss a little bit later that it also matters for resilience to shocks. And what I want you to think, and the shock I'm going to look at is the financial crisis. Because when you have an industry cluster, firms are building relationships. these relationships that are not only, of course, there are commercial relationships, but it's also social capital. So when there is a negative shock, like for example, a recession, because different firms in the cluster are facing the shock with different intensity, some firms are having a greater negative shock, other firms are lower negative shock because they're experiencing better, for example, financial circumstances, they can share the shock. They can also share skills. So that is these clusters, as I will show you later, are also very resilient. Now, so if these clusters are so great, how can we make them more resilient, stronger? And I'm going to talk about two policy areas to what I'm calling anchoring your regional comparative advantage. So if you're a city and you're very good at something, how can you make sure that you keep that comparative advantage? And to do that, I'm going to talk about the supply chain economy. It's going to be very important that you access specialized inputs. More and more, those inputs are going to be services. These are not manufacturing inputs. And then I'm going to talk about access to talent, gender inclusion and innovation. So this is the rest of the talk. If I ask you, this is analysis based in the US economy, but we could do the same for the UK. If the people are interested, please talk to me and we can figure out how to implement this here. But basically, the question that I'm trying to answer, this is now with my co-author, Karen Mills. And the question is, where are the good jobs and innovation happening in the US economy? And we look at around 20 years, from 1998 to 2019. And there, what I'm showing you is the employment trends. Of course, we all know that manufacturing has been going down by almost 30% in this 20-year period. But then we also know that there is servicification. There is more jobs in services. And people became very pessimistic about this. Oh, services, they are low skill, low wage, they don't innovate. But in this room, we know that services are very heterogeneous. And there is a type of service which is this input, what we call the supply chain traded services, that is the ones with in the blue line, huge growth, 50% employment growth during this time period. It also has the highest wages in the economy, but also is experiencing as well a lot of growth in wages. So this is an area where we're seeing a lot of value being created, and that's what I'm going to discuss. Now, what are the supply chain traded industries? These are going to be industries and firms that primarily what they produce, whether it's a manufacturing input or a service, is going to be sold to other businesses versus personal consumers. So think about business to business versus business to consumer. Many examples, including smart logistics, enterprise software with different applications like cybersecurity, cloud computing services, fintech, consulting services. These are all part of these high growth supply chain traded services. Once again, how do we measure this? There are papers with all the details. But what is very important is that the trade data is not good at this. Very often the trade data refer to them as intangibles, but actually they're not intangibles. We can measure them. They are creating a lot of jobs and well-paid jobs. These are STEM-intensive jobs. What we do first is like, okay, conceptually, why you care so much about these inputs? And it is that they have three attributes that make them very important for innovation. They're producing specialized inputs that they have to be integrated in the value chain of a firm. And in that process, you're creating a lot of knowledge and also improving the productivity and performance of the firm that is utilizing that input that you're creating. The second attribute is that they have what we call that very upstream in the economy. So they have many layers of buyers. That's very important for the diffusion of your innovation. And the third attribute is that they are going to contribute to these economies of agglomeration in clusters. They benefit from being in industry cluster, but they also are a very important piece of what makes industry clusters so innovative and resilient. How we measure this, we separate 1,000 industries into the supply chain versus business to consumers using input-output tables. Lots of detail in the paper of how we do that. Now, what do we find? Well, what we find is that indeed the supply chain economy is different and it's very important. It has 44% of all the jobs in the US and almost half of all the firms are there. The wages are 66% higher than for the business to consumer industries. And this is also the part of the economy that is going to be very important for innovative activity. It has almost 90% of all the patents in the economy are happening in these supply chain industries, and also a much higher STEM intensity. And STEM means science, technology, engineering, and math kind of occupations. Very relevant, but still this is very aggregate. So now let's look at the different type of suppliers. And now what we do is that we combine our categorization with two other categorizations, traded versus local. Remember that for the cluster, those are the traded industries, and also manufacturing versus services. And if you look at to the left bottom, you can see that there are these supply chain traded industries. Often we're obsessed with manufacturing, but the inputs that are manufacturing is only 6% of the employment. In the service inputs, we have 20% of all the jobs in the US, 17% of all the firms, and almost 20% of all the startups in the US economy are the supply chain traded services. So if we're interested in economic development and innovation, we need to pay attention to these service inputs and how are they different. Here is now I'm diving in the traded economy, this business to business, supply chain, manufacturing versus services. And when you look at the supply chain traded services, there we identify more than 200 industries, including a lot of design services, engineering services, cloud computing, logistics. Came back. 20% of all the jobs, as I mentioned, wages are 62% higher than in the US economy. And now I want you to pay attention to the STEM intensity. This is the part of the economy that has the highest STEM intensity. Almost 20% of all the jobs are STEM. So the STEM intensity is not in manufacturing, it's in the services. Now, but it's also important for you to notice where are the patents. The patents are going to be in the supply chain manufacture inputs. However, the STEM intensity, the innovation that is capturing people, embedded in people like software, is going to be in the input services, supply chain traded services. So I think this is also highlight a challenge for many of us is how do you measure innovation in these services that may not be using patent to protect their very important innovation that is embedded in the people. So that, let me explain, okay, why is such a high growth? What's happening? So let me go back to the attributes I mentioned to you before, in particular that they have many layers of buyer, and that allows them to scale up and grow. And I wanted, in the paper we measured that, I want you to think of two indicators of upstreamness. One is to how many industries you are selling. And then that is a more complicated one that is going to take into account the buyers of buyers of buyers, okay, all those layers. And that I call upstreamness. Now, for all of you, it's not surprising if I tell you that a semiconductor is a general purpose technology that is very upstream and sells to many industries. So semiconductor sells to 65% of all the industries in the US, and has higher upstreamness than the average in the US economy. However, cloud computing services is much more upstream. Look at in the right upper corner there, you have cloud computing is selling to 90% of all the industries in the US, plus super upstream. It has many layers of value. And that's why we see this scalability of the firms that are doing these cloud computing services. How to define cloud computing services in the US? That is an industry, that is an all industry that's called data processing and hosting. And basically, a lot of the cloud computing services is about how to use data in a smart way. AI is about how do we use data in a smart way. But hopefully the point that I'm trying to make here is that we used to think of general purpose technology as something that's manufactured. And more, the new general purpose technology are these technology intensive services. So that has implications how we think about policy and innovation more broadly. I mentioned to you resilience. So is clusters helping these industries? So what you have in this graph is that we're estimating what is the, if you're an industry that participate in an industry cluster, what happened to your annual employment growth? And we have separated the traded industries into types, the supply chain versus the business to consumer. You can see that the estimated coefficient is statistically different from 0 for all the industries during the whole business cycle, meaning that all the industries, good news, benefit from participating in the industry clusters. But the ones that benefit the most are these inputs, the ones in blue, the supply chain traded industries. And they benefit during the whole business cycle, but especially when you have uncertainty, when you have a negative shock. In this case, the shock, if you see during 2007, 2019 was the financial crisis. So these industry clusters are important to help firms to respond to the uncertainty associated with shocks. Now, and probably I do have to move. Oh, so I'll go very fast, but that's okay. What are the firms in this type of supply chain traded services? You can think of 3 types of firms. It's going to be startups, many startups. It's going to be manufacturing firms that have been transforming into primarily service firms like IBM. And the third group is firms that we don't often talk about them, but these are service firms that they continue to grow and create jobs, whether it's engineering services like ICOM or Accenture, in technology consulting, and many others. And the third group is been particularly important in creating these jobs. Now, to our surprise, we thought we were going to see a lot of startup activity. Now, the number of startups in the supply chain traded services is high, 19% of all the startups. But the entry has been declining, a decline of 18% in the entry during our time period. Now, then the question is, why are these startups facing increasing barriers? And what could be some of those barriers? And some of the barriers are the ones mentioned this morning: access to data, access to digital infrastructure. That's going to be very important for these startups in this area of the economy. So then we do have a paper, it's a policy briefing where we discuss different interventions to help these scale-ups and startups and firms in these service inputs. And it's basically policies related to how to access STEM, access to the buyers in industry clusters, access to the data, and digital infrastructure and access to capital. And I'm just going to focus on one, the first one, because it will help me transition to the rest of my talk. We need, I told you that this is an area that is very STEM intensive in the kind of skills that you need. However, many cities, at least in the US, I don't know whether it's the same thing in the UK, they have a shortage of STEM skills. Interestingly, though, when you look at least the US data, we see an increase in the percentage of STEM PhDs, and they constitute almost 10% of all the STEM workforce. But the question is, do we retain those PhD that we're training, or do they leave to other countries, for example? Also important, it's going to be my final point, is that even if we need STEM, we find evidence that we are underutilizing our STEM talent. In particular, we are underutilizing the women with STEM skills. And that's going to be, in a minute, I'll discuss that briefly. But that means that in order to improve access to STEM skills, we need to think very carefully about this utilization. We need to think about training, retraining. We need to think about collaborating with some big firms that have done this very successfully. Firms like IBM that have been transforming from manufacturing into this new type of services. They know what is the kind of new training employees need. So can we engage them in the policy table? In the policy briefing, you have many ideas about how to do this, but let me move on to the final point, mapping female inventor inclusion. This is a real problem. I know some of you may have fatigue of this topic because you see often in the news, but I like to look at facts. And the facts is that in 2020, when you look at all the US patents, only 18%, and I'm going to give you the best number, 18% of all the new inventors were women, far from parity. Then when you look at patenting productivity, 9% of all the patents, only 9% can be attributed to women. So this is a really big problem, not only in the US, but in any country. I told you that this is not a problem of supply. When you look at the percentage of women with STEM bachelors or STEM PhDs, those numbers have been increasing very rapidly in the last 2 decades. When you look at 2020, basically the share of female with STEM skills is almost double the share of women that are new inventors in patents. So this really raised the question of what is the role of organizations, of industry clusters and location to make sure that we transform the female talent into new inventors. And to link it back again to industry clusters and the topic of the beginning is that we do know that patents are highly concentrated by field in industry clusters in few locations. I give you just some numbers in the map, by the way, 5 minutes. So I'll give you the overall numbers is that when you look at all the technology clusters, by the way, you have computers and communication, includes AI, quantum computing, software. 10 regions, 10 economic areas have 67% of all the patents for that field. So those 10 regions can play a big role in accelerating the inclusion of women in patents. However, when you look at the data from 2000 to 2020, the participation of women in this top cluster is very low. Only 12%, 12.5% of all the inventors in the top clusters are women. And this raises a challenge and an opportunity. If we want to make these industry clusters even more impactful and regions more resilient, we need to utilize talent. Firms are going to play a big role. 25% of all the patents in the US are created by 30 firms. Think about the US economy has 5 million firms. 30 of them account for a quarter of all the patents, which means that these firms can play a big role in engaging women with STEM skills into patenting. And there you have the score, the percentage of female new inventors, very far from parity. Some of them do better than the US economy, but I want you to really notice is that these scores are very far from the supply. The supply of women with STEM holders, bachelors, 37%. Compare that to even if you look at Johnson & Johnson, a score of percentage of female new inventors of 28%. And actually, when you look at, take into account that Johnson & Johnson is specialized in drugs and medical, in that field, the percentage of women with a STEM skill is almost 60%. So it gives you really an idea here that we seem to be underutilized in talent, which is a very expensive thing for a region if we really want to be resilient. I think now I'm out of time. So I leave maybe this here for further discussion if we want to talk about some of this topic, but more broadly, why don't I now open it to questions? Thank you.
So questions, we've already got the first one over there. And then people online will take questions if we've got the time.
Okay, yeah. I think there's a. I don't know if there's too much of a discretion, but I think there's a, especially related to your talk, like an elephant in the room, especially in the US and the UK, which relates to female contribution on the STEM side. And I would not only say only female, but I think this hits hard on females, which is affordable early age childcare, which is extremely expensive in both countries. And I thought about it recently, and I thought this, as we talk about growth, and I think this would be one of the biggest potential boosters in, well, especially these two economies for potentially starting growth. And I wanted to know if you have any thoughts.
Yes, and I'm actually working on a paper related to this topic because women are geographically constrained because of family considerations. It means that if they're going to participate in a team with other inventors, it's very important that those inventors are nearby because they cannot travel it's very hard to travel for 3 days to meet with inventors far away. So that's why it's not only very much related to this idea that family consideration continues to be imbalanced, and still a lot of that effort is still much more on the women, but also because of that, they need to optimize differently in how they create teams. And that's why it could be particularly beneficial to be in these industry clusters where there is density of inventors and the potential collaborators are nearby, which is very important for any inventor that have these family considerations.
Great. I think we've got a question there and then one from over there.
Well, thanks a lot for this. There was many things in there, so I'll try and keep it short. One thing was about these services, and so you started off with these knowledge-intensive services and the specifics, but one thing that you often have when it's B2B is, of course, there's a link with some manufacturing, and it's not like they're separate in some separate category, and there's also related to some changes in how manufacturing is organizing itself over time, etc. So it would be interesting to know, how many of those are how strong are these connections? Because you can be just a supplier, you just outsource, versus you're kind of supplying many others. So it's just an interesting thing to look a bit because in those categories, I understand why you do them, but it's interesting. Is the skills intensity really is it really in the services, or is it still related and linked very much to a lot of the manufacturing? It's just an interesting question, but I have
maybe I answer that first so that I can keep it in my mind.
Yeah.
So that's why we also map this concept to industry clusters, because if I think of an information technology cluster, there you have the semiconductor, so that's the manufacturing input, but also a lot of the software part. But what is also important to recognize that until very recently, we've been very obsessed with things that are physical. I think we understand that we can touch them. So we put a lot of emphasis on the semiconductor part, but then a lot of the value and innovation is in the software part. And the kind of STEM skills are very different. What we find is still the case that some of the engineering skills is going to be more on the manufacture side of the inputs. But a lot of the computing related skills are becoming so important are in these services. But I agree with you that then we need to go back to the concept of an industry cluster where you have these linkages.
Sorry, there was
There was
I have
another
more.
question over there, the two, yeah.
Who is first?
So can I just? I've got the microphone.
Okay, all right.
And I'm available throughout the day, so I'm happy to discuss. Yeah.
Okay, so
So I just one more thing, and you don't have to, you can just take the next question, but I think there's also a question about the linkages. I think the best clusters are the ones that are linked to other clusters, so that you have this global local relationship that I think is also interesting to capture. You probably do that. We can do it. And then the other thing I was wondering about is the data, because we're talking here about alternative data sources. From what I see, a lot of the data that you are using are part of the, what I would call the traditional data. Patterns, regional statistics, regional evidence, but maybe use
But
other
let me,
things. So can you say a few more things?
Yes, well, we've been creating data. The cluster definitions didn't exist before, so we create that data. The service inputs that we're calling tangible. So we have created a new data set that you can utilize, which is this industry categorization that's going to separate all these 1,000 industry in the different types. So all those are now data sets that are available. By the way, you can go to my website or the US cluster mapping tool for you to augment with other important data sets. I agree, the challenge, a lot of the challenge when measuring innovation is how can we move away from patents? So patents has a lot of relevant information, but we need to look beyond patents because also, as I mentioned, many of these services do not patent.
okay, so person closest to the window.
Yeah, so it's sort of a follow-up. So thank you very much for the presentation. I really need this for the UK. It would actually, everything makes my business case for me. So it was very exciting to see it. I really believe the underutilization of female talent, but I was interested. So you had, when you talked about the traded services, patents play less of a role, which is what we know from the digital sector. So are there other metrics that we should look at? Because if you look at the patents and the number of female inventors, it could be that they're in the other sector, which is not using patents as much. Is there something else that we can look at that looks at the comparison there?
What a great question. So we've been looking at, and others have been looking, for example, startup activity, because maybe it's not going to be captured in a patent, but it's going to be captured in a startup. But also we see a very low presence of women in these venture-backed startups. So that's another indicator that innovating, even if you think about entrepreneurship as your indicator, at a much lower level that we see in terms of the skills they have. Ideally, what I would love to see, I've been using trademark data, but unfortunately the trademark data doesn't link back to inventors. It will be wonderful if we could somehow attribute trademarks to particular individuals within an organization. But I think you raise a super important part. This is a great area for data scientists to come up with some new indicators.
Okay, we've got, there might have one question.
So firstly, I think I speak for everyone to say that it was a really good presentation and I especially enjoyed the graphs. So I had two questions. So, you know, that you had a slide on the effect of clusters on, two types of industry. So what is the scale of it? So in the sense, is it 11% or 11 percentage points? So if you could just sort of explain that. And the second question was that, you know, are there vulnerabilities to clusters? So for instance, if let's say one of the flagship things like a university withdraws because of lack of state support, is there any sort of research on that, like how vulnerable it is to collapse if, you know, something happens? So just you know,
all right,
whatever you
let
could
me
share
start with the second one, vulnerability indeed. And one of them that I think sometimes we don't pay enough attention is that in this industry cluster, you need a lot of startups. Incumbent firms are very important. They continue to innovate, but the transformative innovation very often comes from these very young firms. So we need, if you are in an industry cluster and suddenly you see that the flow of new firms is very low, that's a wake-up call that we need support institutions like this one to make sure that those young firms are engaging in the cluster. So I think for me, that will be one where things can, I'm not sure whether collapse, but definitely detrimental for innovation in cluster. The magnitude of the effect, it was actually very meaningful. We're talking about a 4 percentage point annual growth difference if you participate in a strong cluster versus a weak one, or there is no cluster. So these are really meaningful in terms of the magnitude.
Okay, so you just one question.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. It was quite insightful. I have a question about the model. I'm sorry, I haven't read the paper, but I saw the model at the bottom. Did you check for any correlation between government funding or tax credits for R&D and the creation of clusters? So is there any link between the two, which could be quite relevant for the UK? Thank you.
So we did a very insightful question as well. We control for some regional industry trends and region trends, thinking that policy intervention can affect those trends. So that's the way how we simplify that in the econometrics. It's something that we did pay us attention to the financial services cluster because it got a lot of government help during the financial crisis. So we also separate that one from your others, but you raised this very important point of what's the role of government support, what is the role of support institution? I think that is a big opportunity to map support institutions that are many of them doing very relevant work. Can we better understand how they are doing this incredible matchmaking role, connecting suppliers and buyers, improving opportunities for young firms? I think there is a big opportunity for both research and policy work on that area.
Okay, well, I'll have to leave it there for the questions. I think Meng Song online will have to miss out your question, unfortunately. So would you like to join me in thanking Mercedes for a brilliant